certainly the developer went through additional layers of expense as a result of what was requested upon him, correct?
Absolutely.
And that's something that happens over and over and over again. No question about it. I like
So,
this section of your book that distinguish between neighborhood defenders and the not in my backyard group, which of course is the NIMBY. The acronym is the NIMBY. Can you elaborate on that, please, Professor Palmer?
sure. So we often talk about people who oppose housing and change in their neighborhoods as NIMBYs, not in my backyard, that they're opposed to anything happening. And it's very much a view that I think casts them as only thinking about themselves, as very selfish in what they're looking for, not looking to hurt their own property values, not looking for inconvenience from traffic, that sort of thing. But when we looked at all these comments, the way that people talk about themselves and their role in the process of these meetings is not that way. It's really about protecting their communities from unwanted change. They're really focused on the larger community and their neighborhood and the other people in their neighborhood. And that might be partially just be a way of framing how they talk about things, but they really do seem to see themselves as protecting their neighborhood. It's not about being personally inconvenienced, but protecting this larger neighborhood and community that they've been a part of. And the term also ties back. We're not the first people to use the term neighborhood defenders. It ties back to a long range of studies thinking about integrating, racially integrating cities and towns throughout the 1900s, and people to try to defend their communities from change and racial threat that way. And we're not saying that everybody here is worried about racial threat, but really that idea of it's not just what I want, but I'm protecting this community that I belong to. And so we think that we're just trying to get away a little bit from the idea that all NIMBYs are just selfish and thinking about what they want, and thinking that at least to them they have some noble goals of what they're looking for, even if we're not very sympathetic to how they achieve those goals and what they are.
I like the section of your book that states that housing costs are a totally huge problem. Again, some stunning numbers. An individual or family earning $80,000, which is well above the national median income of $55,000, would be cost burdened in renting a median one-bedroom apartment in coastal housing markets such as Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, New York, and Boston. And the book also stresses, and this is important, that the situation is not limited to coastal housing markets. And the picture is even more dismal for low-income individuals and families. Is it safe to say that neighborhood defenders are continuing to ignore data of this type?
I'm not sure if I'd say they're ignoring it, but they're certainly not sympathetic to it. I mean, one thing that's really striking to us is that we see a lot of opposition in places where people are very liberal, where there's, will tell you they're very concerned about income inequality, about the lack of income growth, about the increased cost of housing. They share these concerns at a large level, and they just don't want this housing in their neighborhoods. And one interesting study we do in the book is we look at a law in Massachusetts called Chapter 40B. And Chapter 40B is a process for building projects with a certain amount of affordable housing that lets you bypass town zoning and planning board. So essentially you get your permit, can bypass a lot of the process, bypass a lot of the regulations if a certain amount is affordable housing, which is an unpopular law in a lot of cities that have had projects foisted upon them that they didn't want. But in 2010, there was an effort to repeal that law, and that repeal failed. And voters, when they had a chance to get rid of it statewide, chose not to by a pretty large margin. And in many of the towns we looked at, we see very, very high support for keeping the law, and yet still very low support for any housing being developed there. And so there's this big disconnect between the policies we want to see in general and then the actual housing we want to see in our communities, whether in our immediate neighborhoods or our towns and areas. One thing that's not in the book, it's part of a newer project we're looking at, is in Newton, Massachusetts, a city right outside of Boston, a fairly wealthy suburb. There was a project to replace an old, rundown industrial complex with a nice big mixed use development, mixing affordable housing, market rate housing, commercial and everything. Really well developed project with years of approvals and studies and everything. And ultimately ended up going to the voters for a referendum. And that referendum happened to fall on the same day as the Democratic primary in 2020. So that first week of March here. And voters came out in a very liberal city and actually voted in favor of this project. This project passed with like major costly organization by the developers and by pro-housing groups in the city. But it didn't pass with nearly the vote share of some of the very liberal candidates on the Democratic ballot. And so people were going and voting for Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and their housing plans. They're very progressive, building more housing plans, and yet voting against these projects in their own community at the same time. And so that's really interesting to us, that sort of the general policy approach, yet not matching what they're actually doing in their own communities. And so when we talk to developers, we'd sometimes ask them, are there places you avoid? Not because there aren't great opportunities here, but because you know that they're going to organize and delay and make it not worthwhile. Take a project that would be profitable and make it unprofitable, or just make their lives miserable for years as they try to get something built. And we heard about town after town where people said, oh, I wouldn't even bother proposing something there because I know that planning board is going to stop it. The people there are going to sue and mobilize, and we're not going to get anything built, and we're going to end up losing money there just through litigation. And so what that means is the suburbs, the places that are most able to organize and delay, not only do they see less development, but they don't even see a lot of development that could happen. We couldn't even just look at the projects that get reduced or stop there, because there's projects that could happen that never even get proposed because the developer knows to stay away from that town. And our favorite example in the book is about Ashland, which is a sort of further out suburb of Boston. And there was a large piece of land there, and the developer first tried to build senior housing, which was needed in that area, and the neighbors organized and stopped that. They tried a few other things, and they ended up pursuing a 40B project, this law that allows them to build affordable housing and bypass the town zoning and planning boards. And they move forward, they have a lawsuit, they win that, win another lawsuit, they move forward, they finally get their permit. And ultimately the town, at their town meeting, and I don't know if you have this where you are in New York, but Massachusetts, a lot of towns have town meeting, a form of direct democracy, where either everybody in the town or their representatives actually get to vote on policy changes. They voted to raise their own taxes to buy the land from the developer to prevent that housing from getting built. That's something that can only happen in a town with a certain level of resources. They raise their own taxes to buy this land from the developer. And now it just sits there empty. It's not adding any economic value to the community, doing nothing for its tax base, not providing housing for people who need it in that area. And that to me is the ultimate example of the power of delay and stopping a developer. And if you ask that developer now, would they build anything else in Ashland, they would run away screaming. They're not going to touch it again.
Can you please explain the research in your publication that involves public opinions about new housing, whether it be NIMBY attitudes, economic self-interest, fears on the loss of home values? Can you touch on those subjects, please?
Absolutely. We're not focused too much on public opinion as measured in a survey, but certainly looking at the comments people express. There's a lot of discussion of economic self-interest, of concerns about property values. It turns out in the studies that have been done of this, there really isn't a negative impact. In fact, there's often a positive impact of new development. The concerns that you're going to have new development is going to destroy your property values really haven't been borne out. Whether that's market rate or affordable housing being built in your communities, but there's that fear, right? For most people, their home is their single biggest asset, their biggest investment, and they're very risk averse. They're very much worried about how that could be impacted and how it would change.